Today I'm going to be answering more questions from viewers. Every time I do this, I think, I'm sure I won't have to do this for another 6 weeks, but then I always get a load more questions. So I've got plenty now, so I really need to answer these questions before it gets out of control. So I'm going to pedal through these as quickly as I can. So firstly, question number one is, what can we do to help? So there's two things that I would say to this question. The first thing is, we must bear in mind that we've already achieved something that has never happened in Britain, and possibly there's never been this amount of support in this time frame for someone who suffered a miscarriage of justice. You know, Lucy has an unprecedented level of support, and that has not occurred due to the legal system. It's not occurred due to the media. They are very important roles. You know, Mark McDonald's a very important aspect of this, and I watched him being interviewed very shortly after Lucy was convicted. And of course, he plays a massive role. Media plays a massive role, mainstream media, but it really all comes and stems from efforts online, a grassroots campaign of activism, and everyone contributes to that. Every single time you post on something, every single time you post something online yourself, every single time you share some information, all of that has contributed to the situation we have now, which is that we're further along the route of exonerating Lucy Letby than has occurred in such a major case previously. And if it wasn't for that, make no mistake, Lucy Letby would be in prison for a very long time, and that would be definite. As I've said before, the Birmingham Six were in prison for 16 years, and nothing happened in their case for 12 years. It was only after 12 years, when there was a World in Action documentary, then a book, that things started to happen. So we're already as far along as the Birmingham Six within 2 years. The slightly worrying thing is it still took 4 years. Even after the first appeal, it took 3 years for the Birmingham Six to come out. So we obviously need to keep up the pressure in every way possible. In terms of what you can specifically do to help, what I would say is that no one person's contribution is more important than another. I suppose that I have a slightly prominent role now because I've done this channel and people know my name, and I suppose that I'll become more public over time. But my contribution's no more or less important than anyone else. Everyone just has to do what they can, and things that you're doing online, things that you're doing in terms of sharing information, things that you're doing in amplifying the work of people that have written things in newspapers or done work online or done alternative media, that all helps. I know people have written letters. Obviously, there's petitions that I've highlighted. There is no single one silver bullet that is going to exonerate Lucy Letby, and there is no one person that will be responsible. It's going to be a community effort. It's going to be a group effort from thousands of people. It's coming more and more into the mainstream consciousness. That's going to happen more and more in the months and years to come. So just keep doing anything that you can possibly do. The lawyer Lucy Letby used is basically a small town lawyer who normally deals with parking tickets and conveyancing. I wonder if it's who she used to buy a house. He would have been entirely out of his depth with the handling of this type of case and limelight that came with it. Myers would have been brought in just for the trial dates and would have had minimal time to get across this case. They aren't around in the early days usually. They failed so spectacularly that it's embarrassing. They failed Lucy Letby and should have handed it to someone who knew what they were doing out of respect to their client. She owes them nothing. Myers is just a showman. If Better Call Saul didn't produce the goods, Myers can't just make up shit. So I promised I'd read out the Better Call Saul bit, even though that means absolutely nothing to me whatsoever. But hopefully it means something to someone. In answer to these comments, let's deal with the solicitor first. I have heard that Lucy had something of a personal relationship with his solicitor, where she trusted him. And I have also heard that he was a little bit out of his depth. I can't really say any more than that, because this is just something I've heard from a source. The source is a very good source, so it's almost certainly true. But I won't say any more than that. I think there's definitely... Obviously, when we talk about the defence, and I'll probably mention this again later in the video, we always talk about a deficit of money, but I think a deficit of time is equally important. The police has so long to prepare the case. The prosecution has so long to prepare the case. The defence is quite limited in terms of time relative to the prosecution, so I think that is a very significant point. I think that does have a massive impact on the outcome of the case. In terms of whether they should handed it to someone else, There's this thing called money that you might have heard of. That kind of thing just generally doesn't happen because this is a massive case and people act in self-interest. I'm sure they all did their best, but they're just not going to give a case away when it's worth that amount of money to the firms and people involved. Can Lucy get bail or be released on house arrest? So this is something that's been suggested by both Dr. Shuley and various political figures that are affiliated with Westminster. So I don't know whether it will happen. There's a very strong moral argument for house arrest. She can't be bailed, as far as I understand it, and her bail would be enormous. But she could be released on house arrest. Whether that would happen or whether it would be too politically sensitive, I don't know. I'm personally doubtful that she will be released on house arrest, even though it's justifiable. But it's possible. Do you know, Chris, anything about the police early on if they ever pursued other lines of inquiry? I thought of something she would have thought would be the least they could have done. Did they consult the post-mortem pathologist, the coroner, the CQC, the RCPCH, the neonatologist Jane Horden, the forensic pathologist Joe McPartland to get their opinions on what the consultants were alleging? So we now know the timeline for the police investigation in May 2017. This has been outlined in the previous video. I'm sure most people have seen. So we know that the police turned on a dime extremely quickly. This is consistent with what we heard from in the Operation Hummingbird video released 2 years ago now, in which they strongly implied in that video that they made their mind up very quickly and then never investigated any other possibility. Now we know a lot more about that, and we know that our initial impression on that was correct. So that's the first thing. In terms of whether they consulted all these other people, I've seen very little evidence that they consulted any of these people, and I think if they'd consulted the pathologist and coroners, for example, they would walk in there and they'd go, well, why is this being overturned? Why is Dr. Evans doing this? Why is Dr. Evans making these rather spurious accusations based on rather specious science? So I don't think they did. I know for a fact they didn't look at the RCPCH report because Michelle Warden asked them to look at it and they basically completely ignored her. So I know for a fact they didn't look at that. As for the others, there's no evidence that they did consult them, and based on what we've seen from the police, all the evidence points to it seems very clear. We don't know for absolute certain. I can't say definitively, but it seems very likely that they didn't consult any of these people. Chris, I have an unrelated question for you. I'm pulling together a piece on Lucy's chances with the CCRC, an organisation currently in some turmoil. Of their 124 employees, I'm not sure as yet how many case review managers there are, but I suspect something like 50. Last year they reviewed 1,480 cases, which by my maths indicates on average they spent just over 7 working days per case. I know from your channel that you're one of the most seriously informed people on the planet regarding Lucy's case. You must have accumulated and reviewed thousands of documents. So my question, just off the top of your head, if you were to put yourself in the shoes of a CCRC case review manager coming cold to the case, what would be your guesstimation of the number of working days you would need to get your head around the relevant matters, draw conclusions and submit your recommendation to the commissioners for the consideration? A very good question. So I think it's clear to say firstly that the CCRC are going to be investing more than 7 working days on this case. So there's various ways of answering this question. I was already quite confident that this was a miscarriage of justice after 1 day. So I came down from my study, heard this on the radio, initially thought Lucy to be guilty. Listening to radio, after half an hour I'm starting to think, well, I haven't heard any evidence for this. Then another 5 minutes would pass, another 5 minutes would pass, then I started to look the evidence up myself. Immediately, there was I think I saw the confession note very early on. That's an immediate red flag for me, because I thought, come on, there's no way this is a confession note. So then I just researched for the rest of the day until Panorama came on. Already by Panorama coming on, I've been researching for like 5.5 hours. And I was thinking this could easily be a miscarriage of justice. Watched Panorama, saw absolutely nothing to dissuade me from that view. When they got the psychologist on, Dr. David Wilson, spits on the floor, I knew he would say Lucy doesn't fit the profile of a serial killer. I already knew 100% at that time that that's another major red flag, of course. So I already had strong suspicions that this could be a miscarriage of justice within a day. having research within a couple of, I actually wrote articles that are on Reddit. I've probably deleted most of them now, but I wrote these articles within the first week of Lucy being convicted, and I actually revisited some of them recently, obviously knowing an enormous amount more than I do now. One of them was wrote something about the confession note. One of them was I wrote a kind of response to the Operation Hummingbird video that I will get into doing again in more depth at some point soon. And if you look at what I wrote in response to the Operation Hummingbird video, I would stand by virtually every comment that I made. Like 95% of those comments at least, I would stand by 100%. I just have a lot more details about it now. So now I know that I was right. There's a few things here and there where some of the details aren't correct, so we didn't know that much. And then there's other areas where we now know more, and I wasn't willing to say things that I now know to be true. So I think actually within a week, I was very, very confident this was a miscarriage of justice. And all that I've done since then is look for any evidence that I'm wrong and just find an absolute shit ton of evidence that I'm right. So I really think within 7 working days that you've indicated here, you could be very clear that this is miscarriage of justice, and within a month, you should be crystal clear. Obviously, I'm still learning things this day. I've learned some stuff this week that I haven't announced yet, but when I can, I will. I'm always learning stuff. I'm always being connected with people, always getting a little bit of extra information and detail, but I really seriously think within a week, I was already at least 95% certain this was a miscarriage of justice, and now I'm just 99.99% certain. Well, no, let me rephrase that. I'm 100% certain it's a miscarriage of justice. I'm 99.99% certain Lucy Letby's innocent. There was a sense from the panorama that Dr. Mike Hall is not necessarily aligned with some of the findings of the expert panel. Do we know what exactly he takes issue with? I think he suggested that some of what Shuli's panel have come up with may actually harm her case. Hopefully he's not just got the hump because he didn't get calls the first trial in the end and it's been overlooked for the expert panel. Of course, this could just be the product of creative editing by the Panorama team, I suppose. So to take that last comment first, I think there's very, very likely to be some creative editing, a generous description by the Panorama team. So that's the first thing I would say. We should, before we go any further, we should say Dr. Hall has made it clear that he thinks this is an unsafe conviction and he thinks it's unlikely that Lucy Letby has murdered any of the babies. In terms of what he specifically said, one thing I can say is that I've recently been connected with a paediatrician who knows him very well. I can't say anything more about that at all at the moment, but I just thought I'd mention that. I think he had some criticism of some aspects of it. They may be fair criticisms or they may be mistaken criticisms. I don't know. The thing about dealing with these complex cases is that, and this is one of the big problems with the Court of Appeal, you can't definitively say this is 100% what killed this infant, especially with a neonate, especially when you're not examining the infant, especially when it's now 8-9 years ago that these infants have died. It's essentially, in some cases 10 years ago, isn't it? It's come back to 2015. So to ask for definitive, bulletproof, 100% certain, there is no other way for any other possible opinion, evidence for something like this. That is just not how medicine works. What you do is you look for the most likely hypothesis based on the best evidence, and the best that we have is by far from the panel, and you can see the forensic detail they've gone into, even just in the preview document. And then on top of that, I know for a fact they've examined an enormous amount of documents, and there've been disparaging remarks made online about things they have or haven't seen. They've seen everything. Like, I happen to know for a fact they've examined an enormous amount of stuff very thoroughly. So there's still room for medical opinion, I suppose. I'm not sure why he's saying it will harm her case, but he hasn't seen the full reports. So the only people that have seen the full reports are the people that wrote them in the CCRC. The CCRC are about to refer this case. There will obviously be something of a battle at the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal already has a horrendous record for refusing the appeals of innocent people. What I will say is that our role is to publicise this as much as possible and put as much pressure on the Court of Appeal as we possibly can. It's as simple as that, and that's what I will be trying to do, and that's what everyone should try to do. I don't really want to make any further comment about the Court of Appeal because we're going to be discussing it later. How long did they have the notes before they questioned her over their meaning? Did they take the notes to a psychologist before questioning her? So, no, they didn't do any due diligence. So they didn't do anything other than assume it was Lucy and then try and nail her, basically. How long they had the notes before they questioned her over their meaning, I'm not 100% certain of that. As they asked her questions about them during her first arrest, I'm not quite sure of when they searched her house for the first time, but I think that was in 2018. So they didn't have the notes for an enormously long time before they questioned her. It would have been months and possibly weeks before they questioned her. As for whether they did any due diligence, forget it. How come everything one retired expert from a different field is able to overturn the findings of literally dozens of people who are experts in those fields? It seems that the only thing Sherlock Evans had to offer the police was a different opinion. Whilst it is possible for one person to be right and 99 wrong, it is very unlikely to be the case. So there's a couple of questions here. The first thing is, if the police knew how to run an investigation, they would have got to sort out a second opinion. They didn't do that because they don't understand medical matters. Now, how they didn't... So if... What we've seen is, in previous videos, the police... have the consultants walk into their office, walk into their police station on the 15th of May and say, we're concerned. They're paediatricians. Then a paediatrician walks in, we think probably in May. According to Dr. Evans' latest account, which is different from his previous accounts, he read about this in The Guardian on the 18th of May. We don't know if that's true or not because he changes his story about everything. So we have no idea whether that's actually accurate. But as he said it on BBC One on primetime TV, in my view, all he's done is look this up and find out when it was in the paper and then said to himself, I'll say that. Because he said other things previously. But let's just assume for the sake of argument this is true. That means he's seen in the paper on the 18th of May that this is when he's decided this is my kind of case. So it's very possible, you might even say probable, that he has arrived at Cheshire Police Station in May 2018. So it can be very shortly after they've had this other meeting. So what has happened is, very quickly, they've decided, oh my God, 3 paediatricians have all told us this could be inflicted harm, and one of them said it very definitively within minutes of walking into the office. And what they should have done was take a step back and realise that they needed another medical opinion. But they didn't do that because they're not the sharpest tool in the box. Let's just say that. In terms of how everything can be overturned by one retired expert, quite simply, once the police decide we're going to run with this guy, that's it. They overturn, everything goes out the window completely because the police have the authority to do that. That's why we've been asked in previous videos, how come they can overturn the coroners? How come they can just do whatever they want? The only thing that can stop the police is if the state comes along, possibly sometimes the Crown Prosecution Service, but the Crown Prosecution Service, although they did on this occasion, they wouldn't typically interfere with the police. Usually they don't. The only thing that would usually overrule the police would be the state coming along and saying, look, stop what you're doing, you're idiots. Obviously that was not going to happen because the government were busy doing something to do with, the general political arguments of the time. So that's how it's possible for them to overturn everything, as ridiculous as that may seem. What is the fresh evidence submitted to the CCRC? So, great, it's not opening. There we go. Finally. So, this is a letter written by Louise Mortimer that's submitted to the Thirlwell Inquiry, 17th of March 2025. And this has a big list of reasons why the Thirlwell Inquiry should be paused. And some of these things are among the fresh evidence that will be submitted to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. So the 19 detailed reports is not. 2 reports from United Kingdom's leading statisticians refuting the premise of the prosecution case for an unexplained spike in deaths and a coincidence of Letby being president when babies are said to have died or collapsed. This is fresh evidence. So they are saying as well that not much has been said about this, but they're saying, look, the statistical case is completely flawed. And I think they're probably going to cite Jane Horden being... not Jane... What's her name? Forgotten her name now. It's not Jane Houghton at all. Jane Houghton, sorry. Being excluded from the police case. I think that will be first item of fresh evidence. So there's fresh evidence on the insulin case because there's new research that's been submitted. There's failures of disclosure, as mentioned here, failure of prosecution, that the defence, the police and instructing expert, so this is Jane Houghton. The failure of the prosecution to disclose a medical statement from a treating clinician which could have had a bearing on the defence approach at trial. Evidence from numerous interviews, podcasts and articles from Dr. Dewi Evans since the trial where he undermines his independence as an expert witness. The failure to disclose a new report drafted by Dr. Dewi Evans. The failure of the prosecution to adduce before the injury the report from the RCPCH, which following a full review of the neonatal unit raised several issues. The failure of the prosecution to disclose to the defence the involvement of a senior coroner's officer into the investigation of Lucy Letby and the results of her investigation. The failure of the prosecution to disclose that the coroner investigating the death of one baby did not see important evidence of a hospital procedure which we say ultimately may have led to the child's death. The change of position by Dr. Evans on a key element of the case against Miss Letby. This we say not only may have misled the jury but also the Court of Appeal. So these are some examples of fresh evidence that are going to be put in the court case. I have no doubt it will be enough to refer this to the Court of Appeal. I expect that to happen quickly. I think it's just a matter of time. So go back to the questions. My understanding is that cases can only be considered if new evidence is brought forward. The question would seem to be, does the re-examination of the evidence constitute new evidence? So I think I've answered that question in the previous answer. I think there is sufficient fresh evidence and that will constitute sufficient evidence for the case to be referred. If Lucy is exonerated and freed, I think there's plenty more to explore still, such as in light of this and other grievous miscarriages of justice that have come to light, will there be any meaningful changes? How much faith does the British public at large still have in the system? Is the CCRC fit for purpose? Not to mention, what does it say about a system that needs one in the first place? How should it be reformed, especially in handling emotional medical cases such as Lucy Letby? So this is a question that probably requires a book in itself. Let's go through these questions one by one. I won't do them in order because we'll come to the first one last, I think. How much faith does the British public at large still have in the system? So I have actually seen a poll from, I believe it's by Ipsos Mori, and its simple question is, how much faith do you have in the criminal justice system? And the percentage of people that had a lot of faith in the system was 4%. So there were a certain number of people. I think it added up to about 35 to 40% who had some faith in the system or a little bit of faith in the system. But that's an extremely low number of people that have a lot of faith in the system. Now, I'm quite certain that if you were to go back to the 1950s or 1960s, that the percentage of people that had a lot of faith in the system would have been much, much higher. Now, unlike other people, I don't believe that was because the system was better at that time. I just think, certainly I think since the 70s and 80s, when you're starting to move into an information age, you're starting to move into the technological era, court cases are inherently becoming more and more complex, there's more forensic evidence, etc., etc. I think that the failings in the system have probably existed since that time. It's just that we receive a bit more information about them now. So we're more aware of the failings in the system. The other reason I think there's such a low percentage of people that have a lot of faith in the system is that faith in police has diminished significantly for numerous reasons, and I think Cheshire Constabulary have demonstrated several of those reasons in this case. But I think one of them is simply that people believe, I think with considerable justification, that if their house is burgled or if the car is broken into, the police will do nothing. But a case like this, they'll invest vast amounts of resources and energy into them, and then even when they're wrong, they'll try to desperately defend their prosecution. So I think there's diminishing faith in the system, and I think faith in the system has never been lower than it is now since the criminal justice system was created. Is the CCR fit for purpose? No, it's not. But they have made efforts to reform the system, which is a good thing, and it seems they're taking this case very seriously. So in terms of our immediate concerns, Lucy's getting the best hearing that anyone has ever had from the CCRC. So you can't say fairer than that. You say here, what does it say about a system that needs one in the first place? We had this. So I've had a discussion recently where someone's pointed out that more cases were referred when you just had to refer the case to the Home Office, the minister for that particular government department, which obviously doesn't say much for the CCRC. It is always going to be necessary to have a system of checks and balances, so I don't hold that against the system as such. Obviously, the number of cases, the number of miscarriages of justice, the fact that it's escalating all the time, that is worrying, obviously. How should it be reformed, especially in handling emotional medical cases like Lucy Letby's? So I can only give my opinion on this, but it is widely believed, firstly, that the recommendations of the Law Commission that were made in 2011 should be implemented, and they should have been implemented at that time. In addition to that, what I would say fundamentally is that complex medical and scientific cases, and I believe financial cases, are another area of concern. For any of those types of cases, the jury is completely reliant, almost entirely reliant, on expert evidence. So it therefore stands to reason that you need to get the best expert evidence in court that you possibly can. Therefore, there needs to be a better system in place than the police just go running around trying to find someone and then just hit the defence with as much as they possibly can. And then the defence struggles to get experts, particularly for contentious cases, because no one wants to risk their reputation to defend, for example, a baby murderer or alleged baby murderer, as we have here. So there needs to be a very stringent, systematic process whereby expert witnesses are selected from a credible grouping. How that would operate exactly, I don't know, but you can't just have people being affiliated with a national crime agency and they just go in and then sometimes they're for the defence, sometimes they're for the prosecution. That's testimony to a disaster in many cases, because the witnesses have a vested interest to take the case on. What you need is people that are employed and have a guaranteed income, and then they come in and provide their expertise. That's an obvious way to avoid vested interest in the cases. So I think something like that needs to be put in place, where experts are vetted and experts are guaranteed an income. In my view, would have to how it was done somehow, or they're guaranteed a stipend. I don't know how it could be done exactly, but you can't have a situation where it's ironic that the Court of Appeal supposedly doesn't like you to go expert shopping, because the police do that every single time they have a case. And then they just find someone. If they decide they're going to we're going to prosecute someone, let's find someone who agrees with us. Right, this person agrees with us, we will now prosecute them. That's literally exactly what they do. We know for a fact they don't seek a second opinion, because they could have done that in this case. There's literally no paediatrician or neonatologist in the country who would have walked in and said, oh yeah, this is inflicted harm, in like 2 minutes, and then said, oh yeah, this all must be air embolism. Because every single person I've spoken to with any medical qualifications, which includes paediatricians and neonatologists, all say that Dr. Evans' evidence is ridiculous and are very critical of what he did. So we know the police, in this case certainly, and in other cases I would surmise it's very similar, they don't seek a second opinion. So they literally just look around till they find someone. As soon as Dr. Evans comes up, we know from their own comments they were basically excited. They were like pigs in dung. I'll try not to swear again. I used that word a few times in the previous video, so I'll try to cut down on that this time. They were rolling around in it, because like this expert had come along, and they thought all the Sundays had come at once. Literally they were excited about it. You can see that in their email. So it can't be that way. It has to be that there is a very stringent process in place to make it as objective and unbiased as possible. Another thing I'll suggest briefly is that the quality of forensic evidence that appears in court cases could be significantly improved. That both refers to the forensic science regulator being shut down, and now it all happens in the private sector essentially. And then also there should be very clear standards of what is required in court from forensic evidence. That has not been met in the Lucy Letby case. That has not been met in previous court cases. In this court case, they have not met the standards required by official scientific bodies, the scientific bodies that oversee the specialisms that are being cited in court. That can't happen. That should never happen under any circumstances. So those would be like the three fundamental things. The implementation of the Law Commission, the selection of expert witnesses has to be done much better, and forensic evidence needs to be improved considerably. What is your response to the views of Courtroom to Crime Scene, and in particular his analysis in his YouTube video, I Killed Them Because, which was released about a year ago? That YouTuber has several other challenging vids too. You may have addressed them previously, but if so, I haven't come across these responses. I ask this as someone open-minded on Letby's guilt or innocence. So I've been waiting for this question. The reason that you haven't heard me talk about him is because I've kind of made it a rule for myself not to talk about anyone else. It's the easiest thing in the world to piggyback off other people and to also be critical of others. And I've really limited that to people that are actually involved in the case because they have very serious questions to answer. Equally, if I'm asked questions in the future about other people who consider Lucy to be guilty, certain prominent speakers, although I've made inferred references to one of them in particular, I probably won't answer those questions because I don't really want to be critical of someone. Others, she in particular feels very qualified to make the most bombastic statements, but I don't wish to do that. I try not to do that. And I've really avoided talking about the channel and naming it and being specific because, as I say, people do tend to piggyback off others, and also I'm going to come on to the reason why. Firstly, I don't want to be kind of undignified and rude, and I try not to do that. When I am undignified and rude, it's because there's a reason for it. So when I do that, it's because I mean it. But I generally try not to do that, and before I go any further, let me emphasise that I think the gentleman who runs the channel, who's not as public as me because we don't know his full name, we haven't seen his face, he hasn't been on camera as far as I know, but we know his Christian name or what he says his Christian name is. So I don't consider him to be a bad person, and I don't dislike him. The first thing I will say is that I've been a strong critic of him online previously on Reddit when I wrote things, and while I still believe many of those words, being a YouTuber myself has made me reflect on the way that I wrote and some of the things that I've written. What I would say at this point in time is that the emphasis that he has placed on guilt is irresponsible, and he hasn't wound that back enough considering that there is now considerable evidence pointing to innocence. And he certainly hasn't downloaded any of his guilty content. Now, I wouldn't necessarily expect him to do that because he's made tens of thousands of pounds and maybe even six figures out of the Lucy Letby case. I don't know how much money he's made exactly, but it's a lot of money. So I wouldn't expect him to take those videos down. That would be unrealistic. But I think when you've come out very strongly on the side of guilt, and actually the evidence now very strongly points to innocence, and the evidence that points to innocence is significantly stronger than the evidence that points to guilt, I think you kind of have a moral and ethical obligation to redress the balance. Obviously, he doesn't feel any need to redress the balance by releasing content that indicates that Lucy maybe has been the subject of an egregious and massive miscarriage of justice. Now, you could say to me, why don't you make videos indicating that Lucy is guilty? The simple reason is because it's impossible, because there isn't any good evidence to point to that. I've been looking for the evidence for guilt over the last 2 years when I've been forensically investigating this case. And I hope I'm not blowing my own trumpet to say, someone else has said it in these comments, I believe I've done the most research on this case in the world, because I've had researchers work with me, I've interviewed more people, I've spoken to more people. I doubt there's anyone in the world that's done as much research on this case. Maybe Mark MacDonald, I don't know, but there's not many people out there, if any. So I've been very diligent in this process, and when I started to write my book, and I didn't know I was going to do YouTube, that was not planned at all. This is just something that's happened accidentally. And, it's a really positive thing in my life, and I'm really grateful for the support, but it definitely was not planned. But when I sat down thinking, am I going to write a book on this, I had to think about the fact that I was going to become public, and I decided, well, I'm willing to change my life and become a bit public and a bit of a public figure, a very minor public figure perhaps, but I won't be anonymous anymore. And not only will I not be anonymous, but I'm taking on this thing that certainly at the time was a lot more contentious than it is now. Now, the idea that Lucy Letby is innocent is nowhere near as controversial as it was. But nonetheless, I am still defending the woman who's facing the stiffest penal sentence in British history. I am still defending someone who's guilty of, or been convicted of, murdering 7 infants and attempted murder of 8 infants, who's facing 15 life sentences. The most prolific female serial killer in British history again. So I'm fully aware of the magnitude of this, and I wouldn't be coming out here on the public stage and putting my face on this internet channel, YouTube channel, which I had no desire to do, but it's just necessary if I want to interview people, which I do, because I want to bring that information to people. I wouldn't be doing that unless I was extremely confident that I was correct. So if it was possible for me to put information out there that credibly supported Lucy's guilt, then I would do that. And to be honest, if there was information out there that credibly supported Lucy's guilt, I would abandon this whole thing and I wouldn't be involved, because if she deliberately harmed a baby, even if the baby didn't die, you can throw the key away for me. It's not a problem. But the problem is there is no evidence pointing to that. And the fact that she took some handover sheets home and they did some wonky statistical study, and it turns out that she was on duty more than other nurses because she worked longer hours, and most of them were part-time, and they got some crappy readings, and they got some knackered out former paediatrician to come in, and with significant vested interest, he immediately concluded that Lucy had murdered babies, and then they kind of worked all the evidence around so that it had to be her, etc., etc. None of this constitutes evidence. And then obviously I've examined the court proceedings on the channel, as this gentleman has, and all of the shonky it's appalling. The court procedure that occurred in so many instances is abysmal. It's a shame that I can't get the entire court transcript and go through the whole thing, but I've got as much as I possibly can, and I've looked at all the court proceedings for where I can't get the transcript. So I've looked at it in very great detail, and as you've seen when I'm reading the transcripts out on this channel, that's what his channel is known for. His channel is known for reading out the transcripts. I might say that I don't want to elevate myself in any way, but when I would like to argue that when I read the transcripts out, it's slightly better than when he does it, because he just reads them out completely uncritically, as far as I'm aware, and then infers from that Lucy Letby is guilty, without questioning any of the evidence you're seeing, any of the prosecution tactics, or anything else. So I wouldn't be here now making these comments, answering this question, being a public figure, writing a book, ready to go out into the mainstream media, if I wasn't very, very confident that Lucy Letby is A, innocent, and B, is suffering from one of the worst miscarriages of justice in British history. So it's not possible for me to redress the balance in that way. I feel that he should have done that, and I feel that he hasn't done that, and I feel it's legitimate to criticise him for that. The last thing I would like to say is that I've now had a little bit of experience of being a YouTuber, albeit my channel is a lot smaller than his, and has had significantly less attention, although I've had quite a bit of attention in the last five months or so that I've been doing this, for just over 4 months since I started posting regularly. It's 5 months now because it's the start of April. So I know what it's like to... It is very difficult to be a public figure in this day and age, even the relatively minor sense of being a YouTuber. And one of the things that's tricky about it is that you can't please everyone. So, for example, on a video I posted earlier this week, as usual, overwhelmingly positive comments, but someone said you shouldn't call people liars, or you're not objective enough, or you're not dispassionate enough or whatever it may be. Now, I really set myself the highest standards of being as dispassionate and objective as possible, but if I feel that I'm going to call someone out, if I feel it's justified, then I will. But I really try hard not to do that, and I try to be as fair and balanced as I possibly can. Now, in other videos, when I've said we have to be fair to the consultants because they're paediatricians, they care about the infants, they don't want to do a bad job, the last thing they want to see is a child passing away. And also, I'm not a medical professional, so I have to be very careful about criticising medical practice unless I have good reason. I'd rather leave that to people who are medically qualified. Now, there were quite a few critical comments, almost all of them from people who are always supportive and have been supportive ever since. But there are still a few critical comments saying you need to go in harder on them. So, that's straight away two contradictory comments you have. You're going in too hard on them, you shouldn't say these things, or you're not going in hard enough, you should be harder on them. So it's very, very difficult to please everyone. And you can't really do that. You have to just stick to your guns and say what you think is right. So in the case of Crime Scene's Courtroom, John, I believe is his name, he obviously believes strongly that Lucy Letby was guilty, and he's gone in very hard on that, and he's made that the focus of his material. And he obviously believed that he was right, and he was in court, and he saw the process. And I must say as well, I don't know how much he was in court. I think he exaggerates that, but he was certainly in court for a certain period of time. What I will say in his defence is that experienced court reporters also thought she was likely to be guilty, like Josh Halliday, who's now changed his opinion and think there's a very good chance that it's a miscarriage of justice. He because of the way that the court case was presented, people did have the wool pulled over their eyes. In addition to that, of course, as we've discussed on this channel, the prosecution is in the job. They're in the business of doing that, of pulling the wool over people's eyes, of convincing people. That's what they're paid to do. That's what they're paid enormous money to do. So I know now that it's difficult to be public in any way. Like, I would say I'm more public than him because I put my real name out there and you've seen my face, etc., etc. But he is still obviously quite a prominent voice, or has been a prominent voice in this case. And if you come down very strongly on one side and then it turns out you're completely wrong, that must be pretty embarrassing. So I do feel a little bit sorry for him in that respect. And I have had a bit of an insight into what it's like to have an audience and have people coming on and making comments. And the thing is, like, my skin is like rhinoceros skin, so I just don't give a shit. And people can say whatever they want. And I don't. If people say I'm talking rubbish, or if people say, Lucy's guilty, or whatever it might be, I never delete it. And sometimes I'll respond if people make a reasonable comment. But I'm really not bothered. People can say whatever they want about me. I mean, I get so much praise from people. If I can't take a bit of criticism, then I must have pretty thin skin. And I can assure you that's not the case. So I have that advantage, but he maybe doesn't have that. I don't know whether he does or not. But it's not necessarily easy to be out there and to have people saying things about you. And I said things about him that while I believe, and on his channel, which while I believe to be completely accurate, I wish I'd expressed them a bit more delicately, given that he's a human being with human feelings. And I said things that, although I believe them to be accurate, could have been put more diplomatically and kindly. So I wouldn't be as critical of him as people might like me to be. I do think he should have been a lot more careful with his channel, and I do think he should redress the balance now, and isn't, and I would be a critic of that. But ultimately, he may still believe that Lucy Letby is guilty. Ultimately, he cannot make further content because there's no evidence for that. He's done everything he possibly can do with evidence, but in my view, this channel is about the fact this is a miscarriage of justice and Lucy Letby's innocent. It will very strongly lean towards that, and of course, the evidence that I'm putting forward is much, much stronger than the evidence that he put forward. Finally, I'm sorry if that was a long answer, but I don't intend to answer a question on that channel again, so I wanted to kind of give a fair and detailed statement given my full view. Another question, why did the jury decide guilty? Is it safe to assume that it was due to the spreadsheet and post-it note? So I think they were the two of the three most important items of evidence, the third one being the insulin cases, because the court was told someone was definitely poisoned. Lucy Letby was the only person that could have done it because she was the only person on duty all the time. Oh, look, she confessed in a note. So those are the three things that say Lucy Letby is guilty. Of course, we now know they're all completely flawed. don't you think that the legal aid has a lot to do with the defence? It's about keeping the cost down in fighting the case. So I do think Lucy's defence was quite well resourced in terms of money. I think the time and the timing and the fact the prosecution gets to build its case first and then the defence has a limited amount of time to respond, and I think there are issues with disclosure in this case as well. I think that's more significant than the cost. There are issues related to the resources. Of course, the other major issue is it's difficult for the defence to get defence witnesses, and you can't have a much bigger problem than that. So I think these things collectively are important. I think the cost is probably the least important, but it is a significant issue. Can you think of any legal challenge or avenue that will allow any of the evidence presented or actions taken by any of the people or organisations involved in the conviction of Lucy Letby that might stand a chance in a court that could cause a legal contradiction and thereby create an embarrassing conundrum for the legal system? So, as I'm not legally qualified, I'm probably not the best person to answer this question. But what I would say in response is that I think this is extremely unlikely until Lucy Letby is exonerated. When Lucy Letby is exonerated, the trapdoor will open and who knows what will crawl out. There's going to be a lot of fallout from this case, and at that point there'll be legal challenges, avenues, court cases. The gloves will be off. But until then, I think that's very unlikely. Chris, I'm sure there are an endless amount of questions about this case that will go on being asked for years to come. I have many myself, but I should like to ask you how Myers was chosen as Lucy's barrister. I read somewhere previously that Lucy would not receive legal aid due to a change of policy by the Tory government, and the family also used the firm of solicitors that arranged the sale of a house she bought in Chester. Can you please enlighten me? So it's true that Lucy used this local solicitor because she had a personal relationship with him. I mean, I've heard that's true, so I assume that is true. In terms of how Myers was selected, I believe he's just a court-appointed barrister. So I don't think Lucy selects him. She has the right to get rid of him and bring someone else in, but I think it's just essentially the court-appointed barrister. Chris, do you know why the RCPCH report was not available to the court? Were the defence and prosecution aware of it? And if the defence were aware, did they ask for it to be available? So, quite simply, this was ruled out by Judge Goss as not being admissible. The defence was certainly aware of it because they tried to include it, and I would therefore assume the prosecution was aware of it. So that answers all the questions. Can I ask a question? I understand that insulin is kept refrigerated, so what would happen if it's added to a feed bag? I wouldn't have thought that they would be refrigerated. Secondly, should the contents of that feed bag have any effect on the insulin? So I'll answer the second of those questions first. So one of the contentions is that the feed bag contain glucose, so these counteract against one another. Insulin and glucose counteract against one another, so naturally that has an enormous effect on the infant. It's not so much that it has an effect on the... I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone knows better than me, but as far as I understand it, it's not that it has any effect on the insulin, it's that the effects of the two things counteract each other. Of course, there could theoretically be things in the feed bag that change the chemical constitution of insulin, but I think, based on my very limited chemistry, I think that's unlikely. I think what is more likely is that constituent aspects of the feed bag can have an impact on how insulin interacts with the body. So with regard to the insulin being refrigerated, I'm definitely going to have to seek some assistance here. So, I have written here, insulin is kept refrigerated, so if it is added to a TPN or dextrose feeding bag, does the fact that the contents of those bags are not refrigerated have any impact on the constitution of the TPN or dextrose bag once insulin is added? And there's quite a bit of discussion here about insulin storage when insulin is added to TPN or dextrose bags, refrigeration of these bags, etc., etc. And then it says, adding insulin to a TPN or dextrose bag does not compromise the integrity of the bag contents due to the lack of refrigeration during infusion. Insulin remains chemically stable for the duration of administration, generally up to 24 hours. The main concern is absorption due to the bag/tubing and ensuring adequate glycemic monitoring, not chemical instability from lack of refrigeration. And then I asked for some specific stability data. So there's numerous studies here, and it goes on and on and on and on about various things and various aspects of insulin. And then I've said, could you summarise how much you would expect the amount of insulin to diminish based on these studies? So then we see more and more various figures, and then rule of thumb from the literature, by the time a 24-hour PN bag is fully infused, only about half to two-thirds of the insulin you put in will actually reach the patient. And that's obviously less depending on the period of time. It would be more insulin would reach the patient if it's less than 24 hours. So I hope that answers your question. You can look into that in more detail if you wish to do so. But it does give an indication that there is some diminishing of insulin over a period of time. It doesn't seem that the refrigeration is that significant, but it was a very good question, and one that I was unqualified to answer. So I hope that's a decent answer to that question. So we'll go back to the questions again. Did Lucy complain about the doctor's clinical practice, then started harassment? That's why she took out the grievance. Have I got this correct or completely off? So that's not quite correct. Lucy took out the grievance procedure because she was thrown off the unit. We don't have any information to indicate that she complained about any of the doctor's clinical practice. And indeed, she said that she thought she had a good working relationship with Brearey and Jayaram. So if she was complaining about their clinical practice, she would not expect to have a good working relationship with them. It's possible that Lucy was quite a diligent compiler of Datex information, which is like the internal record system for the hospital. It's possible that they didn't like this very much, but I don't think you can describe that as complaining about the doctor's clinical practice. The reason she took out the grievance was because they were it's absolutely correct for her to take out a grievance because they were treating her very unfairly and they had her thrown off the unit and off her clinical duties. So that's why that began. Is there any reason why the original barrister would not now comment on reasons he did not bring in expert witnesses? He has attracted a lot of criticism for this decision, so it would seem logical for him to clear up the rationale. Two reasons spring to mind. He thought he had won the case based on arguments presented. He believed Lucy was guilty and saw no point. So those are both logical explanations. Another possible explanation is he couldn't get many witnesses because there are numerous problems in attracting expert witnesses, and the one that he had, he didn't believe that it would help to have him in the court case. So what I can never explain and what I'll never be able to explain is why the barrister, defence barrister and solicitor did not respond to Professor Nina Modi. That is, in my view, indefensible. But to answer your initial question, is there any reason why they won't comment? They just typically don't do that. It's only going to look bad for him, whatever he says, and as far as he's concerned, the case is done, and that's it. And they're quite... And I don't say that to be critical, but they have to be quite hard-hearted in a way, because you go in, you try your best, you win or you lose, and then it's over, and then you got to work with someone else. I'm sure there are moments where they get emotionally involved, but if you get too emotionally involved, then you can't be a barrister. Like I probably would be good at the arguing part of being a barrister. I'd probably be good at the research part of being a barrister. I wouldn't be good at the not getting emotionally involved part because I find that very difficult. So if I thought someone was innocent and I defended them and they lost, I'd be devastated. The guilt would be overwhelming for me. So I couldn't do it for that reason. You do have to be a certain sort of person, and he's just never going to come out and comment. We'll never hear from Ben Myers again, I can promise you. I said, well, the time we might do if there's an official inquiry. If there's an official inquiry and he's forced to speak, that's when we'll hear from him. I'm intrigued by how information has been processed or not throughout this case. The most egregious examples are things that were not documented contemporaneously, e.g. the rash, the needle aspiration, the loss of access, which Lucy Datix and Brearey contested. Why have we allowed things in court that weren't documented, the rashes, and why have we allowed the withholding of information, the needle aspiration? So that's a very good question. Again, there is no good answer to that question. Essentially, the reason that things have been allowed into the court case that either weren't documented or are very poor evidence is due to a catalogue of failings. It's due to failings from consultants and the hospital, then the police, then the expert witness. The primary expert witness is primarily responsible for this whole thing. then the Crown Prosecution Service. I think the judge made numerous bad decisions as well. So, but by the time the Crown Prosecution Service has given the green light, it's too late. And there have been systematic and systemic failings all the way down the line, and that was what allowed them to put stuff in the court case that wasn't documented. In terms of the withholding of information, it seems clear that there hasn't been proper disclosure, and again, that's a systemic failing. In terms of the needle aspiration, it was discussed in the court case, but we didn't have all the documentation that we do now, I believe. So I think this was discussed, but perhaps not from the informed position that we have now. So that's why it wasn't so much withheld, more that I think all the information was in the public domain. I am new to looking into this in any depth. I have read that there was an improvement in reducing the rate of stillbirths. Might there be a case to argue that babies that might normally have been stillborn, but which actually survived long enough to be born prematurely, were then dying from natural complications? There could be a case for this, certainly. I'm not really qualified to argue that medically. It's an interesting argument. I think it's clear that there are several infants in this case that shouldn't have been born on this unit, and among those were the twins and triplets. So I think the picture of the unit is of a failing unit, but also of a unit that cannot deal with what it's been asked to do. Now, the fact that they had a lot of stillbirths suggests that there were other failings in that hospital. As to whether they were arguing, I don't know. I mean, because the expert panel has not made these arguments. So we've had very credentialed experts that have not made these statements and have not made the arguments that you've made there. So I don't know how much credibility that suggestion has, but it's certainly an interesting suggestion. But there are now quite strong medical arguments regarding what is likely to have occurred with these infants, and in some cases they're quite definitive. So I think we can trust those arguments to a great extent. Why are people talking about a retrial if there were apparently no murders? Surely you just let her go. You wouldn't need a trial if there were no crimes. That's true, and I generally favour the quashing of these cases. However, considering the magnitude of the charges and the magnitude of the convictions, as there cannot be definitive exonerating evidence, like there cannot be DNA evidence, or we can't say, oh, Lucy wasn't at the crime scene, or we can't say, look, it was someone else, the Crown Prosecution, the Court of Appeal rather, may decide, given that we cannot 100% say that Lucy is innocent, if with Andrew Malkinson there's DNA, so his convictions are just quashed. Tom Hayes' convictions were quashed recently. But in Lucy's case, it would be more difficult to quash them because it's more a medical debate or argument, essentially. So under these circumstances, it's possible that they could order a retrial, even though a retrial would be very embarrassing. So I'm going to float a theory with you now that I've never mentioned to anyone previously. So I think it's possible that Lucy could be asked, and the defence could be asked to go through a retrial on the cases Child F, Child L and Child O. Because in the original trial, so many of the cases are either reliant on Dr. Evans and his brilliant air embolism theory, or his brilliant injection of air theory, or they're reliant on the shift chart and Lucy being present all the time. Now, neither of those two things have any credibility whatsoever at this point, so it's going to be very embarrassing to have them in the court case. So what the Court of Appeal could theoretically do is retry Lucy on some of the quote-unquote stronger cases, whereas there's more of a case to answer. Even in Child O, Dr. Evans has still come up with this ridiculous tool down the throat theory for which there's no supporting evidence. But there is a bit more kind of contention there, perhaps, that the Court of Appeal might think, right, well, we can have a retrial on that, we can have a retrial on the insulin cases. So that is a possibility of something that could occur. I think if there was a retrial of the cases as a whole, it's going to be pretty embarrassing for the Crown Prosecution Service, the prosecution that has to try and argue the cases, and it would be very embarrassing for Dr. Evans, which would be great. But so I've been thinking recently as a possibility they'll just retry her on those three cases, but they have the power to quash the case, they have the power to retry her on all the cases. Of course, they have the power not to retry her and to uphold the conviction. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. But what you're saying is absolutely logical. But the Court of Appeal might think, right, well, we don't want to undermine the court to that extent, so we'll have a retrial. Which review went critically through the pertinent medical records looking at the care given? Why did the issues found by the panel not come to light earlier? To my mind, such a review did not happen. So I think there's a couple of things to say here. Firstly, you have to realise that this panel are literally the leading experts in the world. So they have an enormous amount of knowledge and expertise. And I'm sure that people that examine the cases at the hospital did the best that they possibly could. But, you can only be as good as you can be. You can only reach your ceiling in terms of ability. And these people are the ultimate in this field. So I think that's part of the reason. And also the other thing to note as well is that when the infants were examined, firstly, we don't know how much time was given. It's bound to be a rush process, everything always is. Everything is under-resourced and not given enough time unless you get to an official inquiry, then they just throw tens of millions at it, like the Thurwell inquiry, but they don't bother investigating anything. And then the other thing to say as well is that some of the comments by Jane Horden and Joe McPartland were echoed by the panel. So some of the issues that were cited were also cited by the panel. But there wasn't a thorough medical review, and arguably that should have happened in May 2017 instead of Brearey and Jayaram going to the police. What was the original date of the inquest and the date of baby O if set, and what of baby P's? I'm not sure if the dates were set, but there would have been... I know there were parents that wanted things done and there were things planned at the hospital. One would assume it was very shortly after their deaths or when they experienced issues. But I really don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if anyone can answer that question. Sorry if you've mentioned this, but the part about the initial investigation is interesting and seems at the early point to be pushed very much by the consultants. That's absolutely true. I read somewhere that one or more of the parents had already begun to put in complaints re deaths of babies and possible mismanagement. Can you clarify this? And do you think this is what suddenly made the consultants step everything up a gear and get police involved? So, firstly, it is true that parents had put in complaints and that it's possible, if not probable, that these would have been escalated. In terms of whether this is what suddenly made the consultants step everything up a gear and get police involved, it could have been a contributing factor. But I think by that stage they were already convinced that they were right. But it's very hard to say. I mean, I've discussed this in previous videos. I couldn't say definitively, but I don't think it was necessarily a major factor. I think it would have been a big deal for the hospital, but it's not necessarily damaging for the consultants if the hospital's been incompetent. And you might say, well, they made medical errors, but equally the police could have found those medical errors, so they didn't know what was going to happen. So I don't think it was, no, but it could have been a factor, and I can't rule that out completely for sure. Seeing Stephen Brearey has reminded me to ask, do we know whatever happened about Brearey's drawer of doom? Did he really have one? Has he ever been asked to explain what was in it? Where did the notion of a drawer of doom come from in the first place? Or did it just contain, as I rather suspect, a rubber chicken, some lube, and a pair of furry gloves? Come on, he looks the type. Edit out the previous sentence for your next Q&A if you like. Nothing gets edited out here. So, a very good question as to where the notion of a drawer of doom came from. It's just a rather juvenile expression, isn't it? That's how I would describe it. We have to assume that he did have one. In terms of what happened to it, I would suggest that some of the information appeared in the police meeting on the 15th of May. We don't ultimately know, but I suspect he used some of it in that meeting. He's never been asked to explain what was in it, no. So I think I've answered all the questions there. We don't know much about it except there was reference once, and I suspect he's handed some of that information on to the police. Would you agree that Dr. Brearey has led Cheshire Police to further investigations, including LWH and the very dodgy statistics mentioned on Panorama? Yes. Would you agree that Dr. Brearey and Cheshire Police reputations are inextricably linked, their golden thread? It's clear that they've had a a relationship that is far too close, and I think it would be reasonable to say that their reputations are linked. Thanks, Chris, for another excellent video. A couple of things I'm not sure about. Didn't Evans claim to have discovered the insulin cases? I may have got that wrong. He has made that claim. He's claimed to have done everything in this case. So, yeah, that's another claim he made. He probably didn't notice that the police had already said someone else discovered them. But there you go. Also, when was Jayaram going to read the Shu Lee paper on his iPad about the air embolism? Was that before his meeting with the police or after? Again, I think Evans claims that he discovered it. Again, Dr. Evans claims that he was the first person to mention air embolism. I can't go into all... I really genuinely can't give my full opinion on that. But obviously it's suspicious. I don't know about Jayaram and this Shu Lee paper and what he was on about. All I can say is we know now that has no merit whatsoever. The air embolism injection of air cases are incredibly weak, and frankly it's just a load of nonsense. Also, in what other situation would potential suspects be allowed to drive a police investigation? That should never happen. You know, I've made my view on this very clear. That was just an unbelievable situation that was allowed to develop that simply should never have occurred. Do you know when Baby D's parents first went to solicitors? I don't know the precise date, but they certainly had a very good case because it's clear that child D was not treated particularly well on the unit and didn't receive exactly optimal care. So in normal circumstances, there would have been, I think, significant legal action taken against the hospital, and the hospital would have had to defend itself. Whether it could have done that successfully or not, I don't know. Hospitals have a lot of resources and they'll fight very hard, but certainly there would have been a case to answer in my view. On another note, I was wondering if anyone knew if it had been considered that Lucy might be on the spectrum. Obviously, it's impossible to diagnose someone without proper assessment by an appropriate professional. The BPD suggestions are absolutely wild, correct? I do, however, think that this could explain a lot of the behaviours that have been used as evidence of her guilt and or being an unusual character. The coldness on placement, the slightly odd comments parents report that Lucy made, her childlike bedroom, the compulsive hoarding of paperwork, the amount of overtime she put in dedication to her work could be seen that her career is a long-held special interest, common for women in particular. I know many therapists and psychologists who are neurodiverse, myself included. This could also explain the Facebook searches in her own time. We know Lucy was premature and this is a risk factor for autism. There are other bits and pieces that have had me wonder if it's possible. I think she seems like a warm and caring individual, and it honestly terrifies me that someone could perhaps have something like ASD or even is a little awkward, prone to occasional clumsy speech, and this could be used as evidence of callousness where there is none. So, the first thing I will say is that several people have mentioned this to me, the possibility of neurodivergence, kind of autism spectrum, or the possibility Lucy's on the autism spectrum. I also can say that one prominent person I've spoken to is quite convinced this is the case, and I also spoke with a psychiatrist who raised the possibility that Lucy, he said he can't say it's diagnostically for exactly the reasons that you've mentioned, but he has suspicions that Lucy could have been on the autism spectrum. What I would say for myself is that I had never considered this personally, and that I think Lucy perhaps is a little bit shy and isn't always the most expressive person. There's one comment from one of her friends where she states that Lucy is very shy and she seems like she has nothing to say, and then all of a sudden, when she's more comfortable around you, she'll start to speak, and sometimes she's quite witty and she'll make a wry remark or something and you'll realise that actually she's very funny. So I had just thought Lucy was traumatised, and the reasons that she behaved the way she did were due to that trauma, and mixed in with a bit of shyness. I'm not sure about the neurodivergence or these other conditions, but I'm definitely open to the possibility that it could be the case. It's not something that I've written in my book, and it's not something that I wish to emphasise on this channel because I'm not qualified to investigate this. It's a very difficult diagnosis for me to make if a professional can't make it, and I don't know how much it helps Lucy at this point in time, but the comments that you've made are not without credibility, and I do think it's an interesting potential angle of this, but it's not something I'm going to be focusing on because I firstly don't think it helps Lucy, and I just can't prove it, even if it's true. But you're definitely not the first person to raise this. We've had people in the comments raise it, and it's definitely an interesting angle on this case, but it's not something I wish to go into personally until I have compelling evidence. If compelling evidence happens, then I'll definitely look at it, but I don't have that yet. 2 years ago, I attended a lecture by Dr. Jayaram, an expert in ASD, ADHD at Chester University, for parents of children either suspected or diagnosed with these behavioural conditions. I've heard mention that Lucy Letby herself may be neurodiverse. It may be why in her therapy session she wrote notes which were reported as being incriminating. Was this ever discussed with the doctors? So I've answered a lot of this, but I'm just highlighting the final question about it being discussed with the doctors. I think it's unbelievably unlikely that it was ever mentioned to the doctors. And if it was, they never took into consideration, that's for sure. Also, at the end of the conference, Dr. Jayaram confessed that he himself was diagnosed at the suggestion by his daughter as she'd noticed some of his behaviours. From my own experience with family members, I know that people with ASD can be highly suggestible and can go along with those around them to their own detriment. So it's possible that this applies to Dr. Jayaram. Again, I can't really say. I wouldn't like to go down that route myself, but if he has said this, then it could have been a contributing factor. I find all of this so hard to square morally in my own mind. On the one hand, I find Brearey and Jayaram's actions to be unreasonable, cruel and unprofessional. This was a witch hunt. On the other hand, if we allow that they genuinely believe Lucy to be guilty, they did need to pursue it. I mean, doctors, anyone, if you think someone's killing people, please say something. I guess the issue is the extent their actions differ from a well-meaning whistleblower. It's not about them being wrong, people are entitled to be wrong, it's that they were so wrong-headed in their pursuit of it. What would an ideal whistleblower response have looked like? So that's another excellent question. I think, firstly, a whistleblower, once they have significant evidence or significant concerns, must act on those concerns as quickly as possible. So to return to the drawer of doom, keeping a drawer of doom and then refusing to share that information to anyone and then possibly revealing it 8 months later is not what an ideal whistleblower looks like. You have to be transparent. And one of the things that Eileen Chubb said to me, who runs the charity Compassion in Care, is that a whistleblower is someone who's willing to put things on the line, who's willing to put their reputation, their livelihood, everything on the line because they know what they're doing is right. That is what an ideal whistleblower looks like. I don't think it was maybe it's a little bit harsh. I still think it was a fair comment though when I said that the actions of Brearey and Jayaram were motivated by cowardice. It's as simple as that. They wanted to get the result they wanted without putting anything on the line. So they've done what you've described as being wrong-headed in their pursuit of it, which is a very reasonable description, perhaps mild description, but I think still fair. So they would have had to risk a lot more and they would have had to have acted a lot quicker, basically. Good video, but the bit I don't get is that you're not a pro in this field but explain such glaring obviousness to all us smucks. The problem is just explained in not deserving a parking ticket. Why have this in the trial, or at least make reference to it? And the prosecution side have their own questions that need answering, but the defence team was information hidden or not disclosed to them, if so what? So I've already kind of addressed this in the video already. So there was information that wasn't disclosed to the defence team. As to why that happened, it's just simply a systemic failing. In terms of the glaring mistakes that were made in the court case and the glaring problems with the prosecution case, again, it's just systemic failings all the way down from the hospital to the Crown Prosecution Service, as I mentioned previously. And what may seem, it's just basically a lack of analytical ability, a lack of intelligence, a lack of critical thinking. And I know Peter Hitchens talks a lot about poor educational standards, and I do think this is a contributing factor. Even when I was at school, really, quite honestly, the education I received was dreadful, and anything that I've learned has been in my own time, but it's probably got worse since then. I mean, I couldn't say for certain, but from what I've heard other people say, that seems to be the case. So I think there's just a lack of critical thinking, a lack of analytical ability, and a lack of intelligence, and that's why you've seen such crap ultimately appear in the court case. Baby Y, if Letby is charged, who would become the prosecution expert, and would the defence stipulate that she is acquitted? If she's acquitted, the previous 2 insulin verdicts fall. So firstly, let me say that I can't say definitively that she's going to be charged or that they're even considering charges on this infant. I just find it very strange what Judith Moritz wrote in her book, and it worries me that she could be charged. If she is charged, we don't know who the prosecution expert would be, but it could be this anonymous person commenting in Judith Moritz's book, possibly. That's speculative and I don't know, but they'd have to have someone somewhere who comes in and says, oh yeah, all these figures are great and all the science is rock solid, before the defence fights back against that. If she was acquitted, the previous 2 insulin verdicts would not fail immediately, but it would strongly count against them. So in that sense, the Crown Prosecution Service might decide not to go ahead with it, and they might decide just to stick with the prosecution that they've got and defend that prosecution. Finally, the remaining questions are all on the topic of this very next question. What are Lucy's chances of freedom? So I believe it's certain that Lucy Letby will be exonerated. Given what you've already covered on this channel, I'm sure it's clear to most viewers that this conviction at the very least is unsafe. But can you see this make any difference in the Court of Appeal, assuming the CCRC refers it back? So with reference to the previous question, this is the problem that we do face, is that the Court of Appeal is very intransigent and has given many ridiculous verdicts over the years. I am concerned about the Court of Appeal, and it should be noted, I mentioned the Birmingham 6 today and I've mentioned them in previous videos. Their first appeal was unsuccessful and they had to wait another 3 years. Now, we don't want Lucy to have to wait another 3 years. We don't know how long it's going to take for the Court of Appeal to hear her case, and we know how difficult the Court of Appeal is. We should say we're coming up to the 5-year anniversary of Lucy being in prison. Lucy's already been in prison for nearly 5 years. So we don't want this to drag on for another 5 years, because that would mean she's been in prison for 10 years. And that's a massive chunk out of her life. We just need to resolve this as quickly as possible. The only thing I can say is that we need to pile the pressure on the Court of Appeal in any way possible. And I do see that happening. It's happening more and more. It needs to happen more and more in the future. I am certain Lucy will be exonerated because all the evidence points that way and the public pressure is going to grow and grow and grow. The time frame is what's important, and we need that to be as quickly as possible. And that leads neatly onto the final question, which is, when do you think Lucy will be released? And the answer to that question is, I don't know. I don't know what the Court of Appeal will do. I don't know when the Court of Appeal will hear this appeal. There's all manner of things that can happen. There can be big interventions that can occur that will speed up the process. The Court of Appeal could turn back a first appeal. We just don't, or it could order a retrial, or it could exonerate her and quash her. We just don't know. What I would say is I would echo the words of David Davis, that Lucy needs to be exonerated and have freedom again while she's in her 30s. She's going to have basically her 30s taken away completely. So it needs to be sorted out before then. And I will do anything within my possibility. I mean, I'm working on this, honestly, 70 hours a week, probably. You know, by the time I've made these videos, answered all the comments, been through my emails, done other research, followed up all the leads that I'm given, like arranged. I've got loads of interviews coming up with loads of people, so, you know, working on that. I get people emailing me every day, numerous people, that I'm doing stuff related to my book. I'm helping other people with various other things. I'm probably doing 70 hours a week work on this, and I'll carry on doing that for as long as it's necessary, because this is very, very important. It's the most important thing I'll do in my life, and I'm treating it with due seriousness. And I will therefore fight for Lucy, and also fight for justice, and fight for the reform of the criminal justice system for as long as it takes. And I suspect that'll be the rest of my life in terms of the reform of the criminal justice system. You know, I have a small voice already in this space now, and, you know, I intend to use that for as long as I'm breathing. So that's what I'll be doing with the rest of my life. I'd like to do some other stuff as well. There are some other books that I'd like to write and some other work that I'd like to do. And, you know, maybe I'll even have a break at some point. But I won't be having a break until Lucy comes out of prison, and it needs to be as soon as possible. So with that being said, I hope you've enjoyed this video. And we'll start the process again now. If you have any questions in response to anything that I've said in this video, please do leave them, or at any time, please leave questions, comments, and so on. Hugely grateful for the support, and we are achieving a lot. We have achieved a lot. We began this video by addressing the question of what you can do to help. Please be advised that you are helping. You are helping on social media. You are helping by bringing things into the press and bringing in, helping to change public opinion. All these little things, they don't seem significant, or they may not seem significant, but it all makes a massive difference. So just please keep trying. Do anything you can possibly do. Anytime you can amplify a comment, anytime you can share something, anytime you can support someone, and any letter writing, petitions, anything you can do, please do it, because it's all making a massive difference.